Have you ever discovered that the people you trusted most were hiding secrets that could destroy everything you believed in? What if your own son's betrayal led you to uncover a truth so shocking it would change your family forever? This is a story about a mother's impossible choice between justice and mercy when she learned that her son and daughter-in-law were planning something unthinkable with her late husband's property, something that would dishonor his memory and shatter the lives of people she had sworn to protect. Before I reveal what happened next, please hit that subscribe button because the stories I share here will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and the power of a mother's love. Now let me take you into a world where nothing is as it seems and where one woman's act of revenge became the greatest gift she ever gave. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was watering the gardenias my husband had planted 30 years ago, and I remember the exact moment because a hummingbird hovered near my face as if trying to warn me of what was coming. And when I answered, I heard my son Marcus screaming through the speaker, his voice sharp and accusing, like shards of glass cutting through everything I thought I knew about the boy I had raised. And he shouted, "Why'd you sell the apartment without me? My wife and I had plans." And those words, plans, echoed in my mind like thunder, because what plans could he possibly have that required my husband's apartment, the one Thomas had worked 3 jobs to afford, the one where we had celebrated every milestone, where Marcus took his first steps, where we had laughed and cried and built a life together. And I stood there in my garden at 72 years old with soil under my fingernails and realized I didn't know my son anymore. Because the apartment wasn't sold, it was sitting empty, just as Thomas had left it 6 months ago when the cancer finally took him, and I had kept it exactly as he wanted, preserved like a museum of our love, with his reading glasses still on the nightstand, and his favorite sweater draped over the chair, and his scent still lingering in the curtains. And I told Marcus very calmly that I hadn't sold anything. And he said, "Don't lie to me, Mother. I went by there today, and there are people moving in, strangers in Dad's apartment, and you did this behind my back." And his wife Jennifer got on the phone, her voice syrupy and false, and she said, "We understand you're grieving, but that property is worth almost $2 million, and Marcus is the only child, and we have a right to know what you're planning to do with the estate." And something in her tone made my blood freeze, because this wasn't about grief or memory, this was about money. And I suddenly understood that they had been counting the days until Thomas died, calculating their inheritance like accountants measuring profit margins. And I told them I would call them back, and hung up and sat down on the garden bench, my hands shaking, because how could I not have seen this? And then I remembered something Thomas had told me 2 weeks before he died, when the morphine made him honest and vulnerable, and he had gripped my hand with what little strength remained, and whispered, "Margaret, I need to tell you something about Marcus, something I discovered." And I had hushed him, thinking it was the medication talking, but now his words came back like ghosts, demanding to be heard. And I went inside to the safe where Thomas had left all his important documents, and there, tucked behind our wills and insurance policies, was a folder I had never seen before, labeled "For Margaret's Eyes Only." And my hands trembled as I opened it, and inside were bank statements and text messages and photographs that Thomas had somehow gathered in the final months of his life. And as I read through them, the world I knew collapsed around me like a house of cards. And I learned that Marcus had been stealing from his father for 5 years, taking money from Thomas's business account that was supposed to go to the retirement home where Thomas volunteered, the home that cared for elderly veterans who had no families. And Marcus had forged checks and transferred funds and created false invoices. And my husband had discovered it all, but he never told me because he was investigating, because Thomas, being Thomas, wanted to understand why his son would do such a thing. And what he found was worse than theft, because Marcus and Jennifer had a plan. They were going to wait until Thomas died and then pressure me to sell the apartment and the business and all the properties, and they would take their inheritance and move to Costa Rica, where Jennifer's brother had a resort, and they were going to leave me alone without support. And they had even joked about it in text messages, saying, "The old man is finally dying, and soon we'll be free. And my mother-in-law won't last long anyway. She's already falling apart." And I sat there reading these messages from my son about me as if I were already dead, as if my life meant nothing more than a bank balance to be divided. And I felt something break inside me, not my heart, because that was already broken from losing Thomas, but something deeper, something fundamental about my faith in goodness and family. And I realized that Thomas had left these documents because he wanted me to know the truth, but he had died before he could tell me what to do with it. And I looked at the photographs of Marcus and Jennifer at expensive restaurants, charging meals to his father's company card while Thomas was in chemotherapy, losing weight and hope. And I saw receipts for jewelry and vacations and designer clothes, all purchased with stolen money, while Thomas worried about affording his medications. And I knew then that my husband had died knowing his son was a thief and a liar, and that knowledge must have broken his heart in those final days. And I wept there on the floor of our bedroom, clutching these papers. The next morning, I drove to the apartment, and when I arrived, I saw exactly what Marcus had described. There were indeed people moving in, a young couple with 2 small children and boxes stacked in the hallway. And I approached them, confused, because I held the deed to this property. I was the owner. And the woman looked at me kindly and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I think there's been a mistake. This is my apartment." And she smiled and said, "Oh, you must be Margaret." And she invited me inside, and I walked through rooms that still smelled like Thomas, but now contained someone else's furniture, someone else's life. And the woman, whose name was Sarah, told me that a lawyer had contacted them 3 weeks ago, saying that a charitable trust was offering below-market rent to families in need, and they had been living in a shelter after her husband lost his job. And they had 2 children, one with special needs, and they never thought they'd find a place this nice and affordable. And I stood there trying to understand, and I asked her what lawyer, and she showed me a card, and the name was Martin Prescott. And I knew that name because Martin had been Thomas's best friend since college and his personal attorney and executor of the estate. And I realized that Thomas had done this before he died. He had set up a trust and put the apartment in it, and Martin had executed his wishes after his death. And my husband had never told me because he knew I would argue. I would say we should leave it for Marcus, but Thomas knew what Marcus was, and he had found another way. And I asked Sarah if I could look around, and she graciously agreed, and I walked through the rooms seeing Thomas everywhere, but also seeing this family who needed help, who had been given a miracle. And in the kitchen, I found it, a letter taped inside the cabinet where Thomas always hid my birthday presents. And I pulled it out with shaking hands, and I went to the bathroom and locked the door. And I read my husband's final words to me. And he wrote, "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered what Marcus has done. And I am sorry I never told you in person, but I could not bear to see your heart break while I was still alive to witness it. And I want you to know that I investigated thoroughly, and Marcus stole $473,000 from the business over 5 years, and he did it methodically and without remorse. And I have all the evidence locked away, and I have made recordings of conversations where he admitted it to Jennifer, where they laughed about deceiving us. And I wanted to confront him, but then I got sick, and I realized that confrontation would not change him. It would only create drama and pain in my final months, and you would be caught in the middle. And so I made a different choice, and I created the Second Chances Trust, and I put the apartment and 3 other properties into it, and I designated them for families in crisis, for people who need temporary housing while they rebuild their lives. and I appointed Martin as trustee, and I left instructions that Marcus is never to know about this until after you decide what to do with the evidence of his death. And Margaret, my love, I am giving you a choice, and you can prosecute him and send him to prison where he deserves to be, or you can let him discover slowly over time that his inheritance is gone, that every property he counted on is now serving people who actually need it, and watching him realize that his schemes came to nothing might be punishment enough. And I trust your judgment, my darling, and whatever you decide, I will support from wherever I am now. And please know that I loved you every single day of our 47 years together, and my only regret is leaving you to handle this alone. And I sat there on the bathroom floor, crying so hard I could barely breathe, because Thomas had thought of everything. He had protected me and punished Marcus and helped strangers all in one brilliant move. And my husband, who I thought I knew completely, had hidden this enormous secret, this elaborate plan, and he had given me the power to decide Marcus's fate. And I didn't know what to do, because part of me wanted justice, wanted Marcus to suffer as Thomas had suffered, but another part remembered the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and called them flowers, who cried when his goldfish died, who once told me I was the best mother in the whole world. And I didn't know when that boy had become this man, this thief, this stranger. And I composed myself and left the bathroom, and thanked Sarah and told her I was a friend of the previous owner, and I was glad the apartment was going to a family who would appreciate it. And she hugged me and said, sometimes I can't believe our luck, and it feels like someone up there is watching over us. And if I ever meet the people who created this trust, I would thank them 1,000,000 times. And I drove home, and I called Martin, and he came over that evening, and we sat in Thomas's study, and he told me everything. Thomas had planned this for months, had liquidated assets quietly, had restructured his estate, and created the trust, and left Marcus only a small inheritance, $20,000, which was exactly what Thomas had given him for college, the amount Marcus had earned before he started stealing. And Martin said Thomas was very specific, and he wanted Marcus to know that he knew about the theft, but Thomas wanted you to be the one to tell him and to decide whether to press charges. And I asked Martin what he thought I should do, and he said, honestly, Margaret, Thomas was my best friend, and what Marcus did was unforgivable, but he's also your son, and only you can weigh justice against mercy. And I have the recordings if you want to hear them. And I said, no, I don't think I can bear it. And Martin nodded and said, Thomas also left instructions for the business, and he sold it to his partner, Robert, and the money went into the trust. And there are now 5 properties serving families in crisis and a scholarship fund for children of veterans, and Marcus will receive none of it. And I realized then the full scope of Thomas's revenge, and it was perfect and thorough, and it came from beyond the... I waited 3 days before I called Marcus and told him to come to the house. And when he arrived with Jennifer, they both looked angry and entitled, and they sat on my couch like judges about to deliver a verdict. And Marcus started immediately saying, Mother, we need to talk about your finances and Dad's estate, and you're not thinking clearly, and we're concerned about your decision-making. And Jennifer nodded and added, we only want what's best for you, and perhaps it's time to consider moving into a retirement community, and we could manage the properties for you. And I let them talk, and I watched them, and I tried to find my son in this stranger's face. And finally, I held up my hand and I said, I know everything. And Marcus stopped mid-sentence and said, know what? And I said, I know about the money you stole from your father. And the room went silent, like someone had sucked all the air out. And Jennifer's face went pale, and Marcus stuttered and said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I opened Thomas's folder, and I spread the documents across the coffee table, bank statements with highlighted withdrawals, text messages printed and dated, photographs of them spending stolen money. And Marcus stared at the evidence, and I watched the color drain from his face. And he said, Dad knew? And I said, yes, your father knew. And he spent his final months investigating you instead of resting. And you killed him, Marcus, not with your hands, but with your betrayal. And you broke his heart while cancer destroyed his body. And Marcus started crying, and he said, I can explain. And I said, explain what? And that you stole $473,000, and that you joked about us dying so you could inherit, and that you planned to abandon me in my old age. And he said, we were going to pay it back. And I laughed, and it was a bitter sound. And I said, when, Marcus? And when were you going to pay back $500,000? And you don't even have jobs. You've been living off your father's stolen money for years. And Jennifer suddenly stood up and said, we don't have to listen to this, and we'll get our own lawyer. And I said, sit down, Jennifer, because I'm not finished. And something in my voice made her sit. And I told them that Thomas had restructured the entire estate, and that the apartment they wanted was now housing a homeless family, and that every property they counted on was now in a charitable trust, and that their inheritance was exactly $20,000. And Marcus's face went from pale to red, and he shouted, you can't do this. And I said, I didn't do it, and your father did. And he did it because he loved you enough to teach you a lesson, but not enough to let you profit from theft. And Marcus said, we'll contest the will and fight this. And Martin appeared then from the kitchen where he had been waiting, and he said, you can try, Marcus, but your father's will is ironclad, and I drafted it myself. And more importantly, your mother has enough evidence here to send you to prison for 5 to 10 years, and wire fraud is a federal crime. And suddenly Marcus realized the position he was in, and Jennifer grabbed her purse and said, I'm leaving. And Marcus said, if you leave, I'm coming with you. And they both stood up. And I said, if you walk out that door, you are choosing to be strangers to me. And Marcus looked at me with something like hatred, and he said, you were supposed to be on my side. And I said, I am on your side, and that's why I haven't called the police yet, and that's why I'm giving you a choice. And you can stay, and you can work to make this right, and you can volunteer with the trust and help the families your father is now supporting. And maybe over time, you can earn back some fraction of the trust you destroyed. Or you can leave and take your $20,000 and never speak to me again, and know that you are dead to me. And Marcus stood there trembling, and Jennifer pulled his arm and said, let's go, and your mother is crazy. And Marcus looked at me one last time, and I saw the little boy I raised flicker across his face for just a moment, and I thought he might stay and might choose redemption. But then Jennifer pulled harder, and he turned and followed her, and I heard the door slam, and I sat there with Martin, and I cried. And I said, did I do the right thing? And Martin put his arm around me and said, Thomas would be proud, and you gave him a choice, and he made it. And some people can't be saved, Margaret, and they can only be released. And I knew he was right, but it didn't make the pain less. And that night, I went to Thomas's grave, and I sat on the grass, and I told him everything. And I said, I lost our son today, and I let him go, and I hope you understand. And the wind blew through the trees, and I felt something like peace settle over me, and I knew Thomas was there somehow, and he approved. And over the next weeks, I threw myself into the trust, and I met the families living in Thomas's properties, and I heard their stories. Sarah from the apartment became a friend, and her special needs daughter called me Grandma Margaret. I helped with the scholarship fund, and I met veterans' children who were getting college educations because of Thomas. And I realized that my husband had created a legacy far greater than any inheritance could have been. Marcus and Jennifer moved to Costa Rica just as they had planned, but without the fortune they expected, and they lived off the $20,000 and Jennifer's brother's charity. And I heard through mutual friends that they were struggling, that Jennifer complained constantly, that Marcus drank too much, that their marriage was falling apart under the weight of dashed expectations. I felt sad, but not guilty, because they had made their choices and I had made mine. And then one night, 6 months after that terrible confrontation, I received a phone call from a hospital in San Jose, and a doctor with broken English told me that Marcus had been in a car accident and he was critical and asking for me. And I sat there holding the phone, and I thought about letting it ring, about pretending I never got the message, about staying firm in my rejection. But I couldn't do it because he was still my son. And I booked a flight that night. When I arrived at the hospital in San Jose, the tropical heat hit me like a wall and everything smelled foreign and strange. And I found Marcus in intensive care with tubes and machines keeping him alive. And Jennifer was there looking exhausted and defeated. And when she saw me, she started crying and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." And I didn't know what to say, so I just walked past her to my son's bedside. And Marcus's eyes were closed, and his face was bruised and broken. And the doctor told me he had internal bleeding and broken ribs and a punctured lung. And they had done surgery, but the next 48 hours would determine if he survived. And I sat beside him, and I held his hand, and I whispered, "I'm here." And his eyes fluttered open, and when he saw me, he started crying, and he said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I ruined everything, and I was so stupid, and I thought I had time to fix it." And I said, "Shh, don't talk and save your strength." And he said, "No, I need to say this, and I need you to know that Dad was right about everything, and I was selfish and cruel, and I didn't understand what I had until I lost it. And Jennifer and I have nothing here, and we fight constantly, and I wake up every day wishing I could go back and do it differently." And I realized then that this was what Thomas had planned all along, and not just punishment, but the possibility of redemption. And Marcus had to lose everything to understand what mattered. And I told him I forgave him, and he cried harder and said, "I don't deserve it." And I said, "None of us deserve forgiveness, and that's what makes it grace." And over the next 2 days, I stayed by his bedside, and I prayed, and I talked to Thomas in my mind, and I asked him if this was enough, if Marcus had suffered enough. And on the 3rd day, Marcus's condition stabilized, and the doctor said he would recover. And Jennifer approached me in the waiting room, and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I know you have no reason to believe me, but Marcus wanted to pay the money back. And we tried, but we couldn't make enough, and the debt followed us to Costa Rica, and we were drowning. And that's why we're here. And my brother isn't helping us anymore because we owe him money too. And we have nothing. And I'm pregnant, Margaret, and I don't know what to do." And I looked at this woman who had conspired with my son to betray us. And I saw not a villain, but a scared young woman who had made terrible choices and was now facing consequences. I thought about turning away, about leaving them to their fate, but then I thought about Thomas, and about the families in the trust, and about second chances. And I said, "Jennifer, I will help you, but on my terms. And you and Marcus will return to the United States, and you will work with the trust, and you will spend the next 5 years helping families in crisis, and you will volunteer every weekend, and you will raise your child to understand the value of honesty and service. And if you do this, I will provide you with housing and support, and you will earn back your place in this family." And Jennifer nodded and said, "Yes, anything." And I said, "And you will also go to therapy, both of you. And you will figure out why you thought stealing from a dying man was acceptable, and you will become better people." And she said, "We will, I promise." And when Marcus recovered enough to travel, we flew back together, and I set them up in a small apartment, not one of Thomas's properties, but a modest place I rented for them, and I made them sign a contract outlining their obligations. And Marcus got a job as a counselor at a community center, and Jennifer worked part-time at a nonprofit. And every weekend they volunteered with the trust. And I watched them carefully, looking for signs of deception or resentment. But instead I saw something unexpected. And I saw them change. And Marcus met a veteran named Robert who had lost his legs in Afghanistan and now mentored troubled youth. And Robert told Marcus his story about hitting rock bottom and finding purpose through service. And I watched my son listen. Really listen, for maybe the first time in his life. And Jennifer gave birth to a daughter, and they named her Margaret Rose, after me and Thomas. And when I held my granddaughter, I felt the circle completing, and felt Thomas's plan revealing its full scope. And this wasn't just about punishment or even redemption. This was about transformation and about taking the worst of human nature and somehow alchemizing it into something better. And 1 year after Marcus returned, I took him to his father's grave. And we stood there together. And Marcus said, "Dad, I know you can't hear me, but I want you to know I understand now. And I understand what you were trying to teach me. And I spent my whole life thinking about what I could take from the world. And you spent your whole life thinking about what you could give. And I was wrong about everything." And Marcus broke down sobbing, and I held him like I did when he was a little boy. And I said, "Your father loved you, Marcus, and he never stopped loving you. And that's why he did what he did. Not to destroy you, but to save you." And we stood there as the sun set, and I felt Thomas's presence so strongly, it was like he was standing with us. And over the following years, the trust grew, and we helped dozens of families. And Marcus became the director, and he poured his energy into it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And he said he was trying to pay back what he stole, not in money, but in service. And Jennifer started a program for young mothers in crisis, and little Margaret Rose grew up volunteering alongside her parents and learning that redemption is possible, but it requires work and humility and time. And on the 5th anniversary of Thomas's death, I gathered everyone together at the apartment where it all began. And Sarah and her family were there, and Robert, the veteran, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the trust. And Marcus stood up to speak, and he said, "5 years ago, my father died knowing I had betrayed him, and he could have destroyed me. He could have sent me to prison. Instead, he gave me something more valuable. He gave me the chance to become a better person. And he created a trust that wasn't just about housing or money. It was about trust itself and about rebuilding what was broken. And Dad, I know you're somewhere watching, but I hope I'm finally making you proud." And everyone applauded. And I looked around at all these lives that had been changed and all this good that had come from Thomas's final act. And I realized that my husband had understood something profound. Revenge isn't about inflicting pain. It's about creating a catalyst for change. And Thomas had gotten his revenge not through punishment, but through transformation. And he had taken his son's worst impulse and turned it into a force for good. And as I drove home that night, I thought about the journey from that terrible phone call when Marcus screamed at me about selling the apartment to this moment where he had become the man his father always hoped he would be. And I thought about all the families sleeping safely in Thomas's properties and all the children getting educations from his scholarship fund. And I realized that Thomas had achieved a kind of immortality, not through biological legacy, but through the ripples of kindness spreading outward through time. And when I got home, I went to Thomas's study. And I opened the safe and I took out the folder with all the evidence of Marcus's theft. And I walked to the fireplace and I burned it page by page, letting forgiveness become complete. And that night, I dreamed of Thomas, and we were young again, dancing in our first apartment, and he smiled at me and said, "You did it, Margaret. You saved our son." And I said, "We did it together, and we always did everything together." And he kissed me and said, "I have to go now, but I'll be waiting." And when I woke up, I knew with absolute certainty that I had done the right thing, and that Thomas's elaborate revenge had become the greatest gift our family ever received, and that sometimes the most powerful punishment is giving someone the chance to become better than they ever thought they could be.